All right. It seems like we have a few more people that have joined. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So excited to have all of you for our really special event here with Boots Riley today. And do want to start off by letting everyone know about accessibility features that we have today on Zoom. So there is the live transcript feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that will allow you to have a live transcript if you do need that for accessibility reasons. So just wanted to start off with that. I'm Malik Mercier, one of your co-moderators today, and we also have Kat here, who is going to take things away.
Hello, everyone. I would like to first start off by thanking Cornell, IC, and local Ithaca community members that are in attendance of this Union Days event. We are so excited to have you. I would also like to thank the generosity of the following Cornell departments for their support in making this event possible: the Workers Institute, the Cornell Department of History of American Studies, Government, Art, and the Cornell Law School. I would also like to acknowledge the student organizations who provide labor and helped organize this event: the People's Organizing Collective USAS Local 3, the Minority ILR Student Organization, and the Graduate Labor Organization. I'm Katerina Restrepo, current senior at the ILR School, and I'll be serving as moderator for this event alongside Malik, an Ithaca College major in journalism and sociology. To give a brief context on what Union Days is about, it's an annually held series of events traditionally hosted by the Industrial Labor Relations School here at Cornell. It allows for a unique opportunity where we bring in labor leaders all throughout the country to come to speak to students and locals about their experience organizing workers, both domestically and abroad. This year, we wanted to take particular focus on how the arts has intersections with justice, especially in the wake of the pandemic, and how it has further exposed the labor movement and the effects that racial capitalism has on minimum wage essential workers of color. So far, we've hosted events in the past weeks related to farm worker organizing and local Ithaca labor organizing in the barista and building trade sectors. And with that brief description about what Union Days is, I'll hand it over to Malik to give more logistics on the structure of the event.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. We're really excited about tonight's presentation, and we have a full lineup that we're really happy to be sharing with you all, as well as some overall expectations that we want you to know before we head into tonight's event. After our introduction wraps up, we'll conclude with or rather start really the event with a brief faculty introduction given by Cornell ILR professor Naharaha. After he speaks, we'll return to the stage to introduce and welcome our guest tonight, Boots Riley, which I feel like they'll be very, we'll just have to pretend there's a huge round of applause happening because we're on Zoom. Riley is a producer, screenwriter. He's also a director and a community organizer who discusses the connections between art and justice. He is known for being the director of the critically acclaimed film Sorry to Bother You, and we're just honored to have him, and I know that I at least can't wait to hear him speak. After Boots Riley finishes his presentation around 7:15, we will toss it all over to you, and that is where you will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have had about his talk or his work. And as a part of our guidelines tonight, we do ask that you place those questions in the Q&A feature that's going to be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so, yeah, I feel like it's weird to tell you all where it is, but you know, you never know for people who haven't been on Zoom as much throughout the pandemic. So that is all at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature will be disabled, so you'll just be using the Q&A feature, and we will be reading your questions to Riley so that he can answer them. And if there are any questions that you have, just make sure again to use that feature and make sure that they're appropriate and just for everyone to be able to know. And now the event, is also being recorded. So if you do have any questions rather that are asked, you'll be able to, we will just say anonymously to give everyone anonymity as they ask their questions. So we'll pass those over and we'll have a hard stop tonight at 8 o'clock. So that's when the event will wrap up. And this is a pretty rare occurrence, Kat, that Ithaca College and Cornell are working together, right?
Yeah, it's pretty rare. This event is hosted jointly by Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations, like I said earlier, and the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College, which we think is really important to highlight because we ever rarely see events that are open to both student bodies, let alone the larger Ithaca community, especially with recent worker-run campaigns that have been happening simultaneously on both campuses. like in this past year with IC's Open the Book campaign, and then the Cornell Graduate Student Union's list of demands that recently came out. We think it's really important, and we're incredibly excited to hold this shared space with Boots Riley. And with all that being said, we would like to hand it over to Professor Nagaraja, a professor at Cornell University ILR School, to provide a biography and formal introduction to Boots Riley. We hope you all enjoy the event.
Thank you all very much. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Tej Nagaraja. I'm a professor in the ILR school. I teach history. And it's really great to connect with you all, members of the Cornell community, the Ithaca College community, and the wider Ithaca and Tompkins County community, and to connect with Boots Riley for this event. The ILR School and the Worker Institute are a space for the study of union and labor issues and industrial and labor relations in our times, and making links between the campus and the community, between research and study and teaching and learning, and actively doing work in our larger society and in our community, with an emphasis on labor rights and labor dignity, from the classroom to projects that are beyond it. And it's great to connect for these Union Days programs. As you all know, it's a stressful time these couple of years, given the pandemic and the economy in response to it, and the electoral crises of our times, and all different kinds of people that are working for social change are trying to see what they can make of it in order to advance their vision. The recent years movement in teachers' labor movements, like the Red for Ed movement across the United States and West Virginia and Kentucky, will certainly keep teachers front and center in our labor struggles. And the pandemic has, of course, also centered healthcare workers, nurses, home health aides, medical assistants, and otherwise, in what kind of claims they can make, given their essential worker service in our times. And as we know, closer to home, graduate workers at Cornell University and across New York State are mobilizing their campaigns, seeing if the changes in the NLRB, as well as in bottom-up organizing in the workplace, can help them get greater dignity and justice. I think, I'm excited to hear the conversation with Boots. And, when I teach Intro to Labor and Working Class History. And in the fall at ILR, I'm going to be teaching a course on race and war. And some of the themes I try to highlight are themes of the intersectional, the international, the intergenerational, and the inspirational when we study labor. And I think we have seen how in our time, social movements have been intersectional, from the Black Lives Movement and the Me Too movement, intersecting with workplace movements and labor movements. And I think you see those kinds of themes in Boots's own work, from the workplace to the community, race and gender and class struggles bound up in each other. And of course, the pandemic has, of course, resonated those further. Also, the international context and the way labor struggles have always been shaped by war and peace, by global justice visions. I think, Boots Riley has talked about his own story and coming out of that global vision, even when involved in local movements, from the struggles against fascism to decolonization to contemporary global justice movements. The intergenerational, I think, is an important theme that I know Boots's own story comes from his own grandparents and parents being in labor and anti-racist movements, being in hard political organizing, as well as theater and poetry. And those crossings and those intergenerational relationships have been so important, from the labor movements of the 1910s and the Bread and Roses theme, to the labor movements of the 30s and 40s, when We Shall Overcome became a movement song coming out of tobacco workers' strike in 1945 in Charleston, South Carolina, to the links between the Black freedom movement and the labor movement in the 60s and 70s, from the generation of artistic figures like Harry Belafonte to our own times, figures like Boots Riley and his contemporaries. And really, I'm excited to hear about further those connections of culture and arts to organizing and advocacy work. I can say for my own self, I remember around 2001 being an undergraduate student, and there was different labor organizing going on between graduate workers as well as clerical workers and other unions on campus. And I remember one of the administrative staff in the office blasting the coup's ride the fence. You can't change things if you ride the fence, and hearing that to amp us up for a certain labor struggle that was going on back then. Boots Riley is well known for his music through the Coup and Street Sweeper Social Club. He's also known as an activist, a cross-movement activist in the labor movement, the Occupy movement, and community movements, making those links, very grounded in the Bay Area, but also making links to all regions of the US and with a global internationalist perspective. And of course, Boots Riley has made a smashing sensation as a filmmaker in 2018 with Sorry to Bother You, which has been acclaimed by the New York Times, A.O. Scott, Critics' Pick, Independent Spirit Awards, Best First Feature. And those are, awards and acclaims, but I'm gonna highlight the Labor Historian Review. Our finest labor historian, one of my mentors, Robin Kelly, wrote one of the best essays on it. So many of you have seen the film, you should see it again and look at Robin Kelly's essay where he calls Boots Riley a master storyteller and a subversive genius, really making those connections. And our school, ILR, Industrial and Labor Relations, Sorry to Bother You is a film about industrial and labor relations and the lived experience of race, class, and gender in the workplace, the lived struggles and the political struggles in those venues. So I'm delighted to be here with the community. I hope to meet many of you all in subsequent events and opportunities. And it's great to introduce the artist, the musician, the filmmaker, and activist, Boots Riley. So thank you all for coming together for this event.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks to everybody for organizing this, all the various organizations, Ithaca College, Cornell, the Worker Institute, Park Center, all the folks, and I know I'm missing a bunch of people, so that's the danger of doing those kind of shout outs. But what I do want to start off, because I read something about one of your fellow students, and I want to pay respects to Sean West, who was recently found in his dorm room. It's, I'm sure, terrible for everyone, and my thoughts go out to friends and family that are there. Often folks are asking me, what I'm trying to do with my art, and what exactly I think I can accomplish with it. And a lot of my thoughts around that are connected to.
It appears as though Boots has frozen. We're going to try to work out the technical difficulties, and hopefully Boots can get on pretty soon.
The man of the hour. We're excited to have you back.
And in conclusion, but no, that's it. All right. Did everybody leave?
No, we still have.
Oh, okay, cool.
You can go right ahead.
Over 100 people.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. So yeah, a lot of people ask me what I'm trying to do with my art, and that's kind of connected to how I got into it. And I got into it by first helping, when I was 14 or 15, helping to organize a farm workers union in Central California, Delano and McFarland, that area. And it was the Anti-Racist Farm Workers Union, which was created by folks who had broken off from the United Farm Workers, because the United Farm Workers were not radical enough. Since we've got a short amount of time, I'll leave it at that. And there was the image and the legend of Teatro Campesino that was around. And so at these summer projects, you'd live with a family that was organizing and working in the farm, and you would, help them by making flyers, making posters, or they'd say, hey, you got to organize the caravan for today. And sometimes it would be like, hey, you got to organize the skit that happens on the back of the truck that happens at the rally as people are going around. So that was to me, art was something that obviously was an extension of the communication that was happening, but was something that you do in order to communicate what you're thinking, what you want out of life, what your passions are. And so just like I think it's important for everyone to be part of changing the world, I also think it's important for artists to be part of changing the world. And another reason why people, often artists, are asking me, well, what do we do? What do we talk about? And this is also a question that gets asked at rallies. I've been at rallies that have or demonstrations that have 10, 15, 50,000 people. And some of the new people that come around are like, well, what's next? And some of us that have been the organizers, like I think especially until recently, we're kind of like, I don't know, lift your voice, let your feelings be known. And, by doing that, we were kind of putting out this idea that, that capitalism works in some sort of democratic fashion, that if enough people said what they thought and what they believed, that we'd create a world in that way. And this was wrong. This is wrong. And part of the reason that that for the confusion, not only in what people should do with art, but in what we should do in movements in general, has to do with, I think until very recently, and maybe even including now, that the left for the last 60 years has avoided class struggle. And I don't say that, and I'm talking about not just liberals, and I'm not talking about just progressives. I'm also talking about folks that consider themselves radical as well. And I don't mean class analysis, I mean class struggle. Like struggling at the point where the function of the working class and the function of the ruling class meet. And that's on the job, right? And there's a reason for that. And that same reason leads to confusion about the role of artists in these movements. So I think what I have to do is I have to back up to say a kind of a very essentialized history of moments that led us to this point and where we can go from here, and how maybe art and definitely organizing connects with that. So right now, a lot of what people think of as radical movements or progressive movements are kind of stuck in the idea of spectacle, the same thing that I was talking about. We get a lot of people in the street and we show that things are messed up. By the very fact that many of you are from the School of Labor Relations, you're probably past that point. But let me start with this to keep going. In the 1920s and 30s, according to Julia Reichardt's 1980s documentary, Seeing Red, there were, in the 1920s and 30s, there were a total of 1 million card-carrying communists in the Communist Party USA. And obviously you could extend that number to the folks that actually never officially joined. And this was at a time when the population of the United States was about 120 million. So that was a lot, especially if you think about all the friends and family and all the folks that, you know, that were around those folks. At that same time, we had places like Utah, Alabama, Montana, you know, being hotbeds of communist activity, where and where the FBI thought of them as hotbeds of communist activity, and there were, you know, militant strikes in Alabama, for instance, where the workers not only went on strike, but they took up arms against the companymen, right? Things were happening in Colorado, actually, but in that case, Rockefeller sent armed thugs and shot down a bunch of the miners. In the Midwest at that same time, you had you had people occupying factories and just taking them over. You had folk on the West Coast. You had the longshoremen, which ended up being a very multiracial struggle in the Bay Area, and where the longshoremen, which were thought of as unorganizable workers, folks that were at the lowest skill level, supposedly, folks that were high turnover and never going to be able to be organized and working at all these different sites that supposedly you couldn't have a strike with. They shut down the West Coast, and the military was sent out. You have pictures of tanks in San Francisco shooting at longshore people, and they won, right? In that same era, you had obviously revolutions happening all over the world, which were inspiring these movements. It wasn't, you know, it was not only militant on-the-job organizing, militant union organizing, but oftentimes it was with a radical vision that said, we're doing this not just for higher wages right now, not just for benefits. We're doing this in order to change the whole economic system that we're in order to change the balance of power, right? And because of this is why so many people got involved. It wasn't in spite of this, it was because of this, right? And outgrowing from that, in response to that, we have what would be probably one of the two biggest pieces of what they would think of as a liberal victory. And what gets classified as a liberal victory, which is, you could say one was the civil rights legislation, and the other was the New Deal. And the New Deal happened while the ruling class was afraid of revolution happening. It didn't happen because everybody, was very, was very shrewd and figured out how to get FDR elected and figured out how to play that game, which senators can we get in and all that. No, they shut shit down. And because that was happening all over the country, and there was a real fear of a growing, practically viable revolutionary movement, the New Deal was enacted in that. When FDR got campaigned, he didn't even have a plan for the New Deal. He said something like, America needs a New Deal, but he didn't devise the plan until it was figured out that, hey, we're going to have to give something back because otherwise there's going to be revolution, right? And so this was a very radical time for the population. And it wasn't just, that whole movement wasn't just, the pictures that we see sometimes are just, oh, that was white people, this and that. No, there's a book called Hosea Hudson, Life of a Negro Communist in Alabama in the 1930s. And he talks about how when that in the 30s, he joined the Communist Party USA in Alabama. And he was in it for 3 years before he realized, and seeing a lot of communists in Alabama, and for 3 years before he realized there were white communists. That's how many, that's what was going on. We also had stuff like we had the African Blood Brotherhood, who was the cadre and the leadership of the Marcus Garvey movement. The African Blood Brotherhood was part of the Communist Party, right? So there was this militant radical thing happening that gets covered up when we talk about in history. It wasn't, and it was widespread. Now, and this is where I get to, this is another place where I get to essentializing, because there's a lot of ways to tell this whole story, but we only got a few minutes, but these are important things. So in the 40s, you know, after that period, there came a time when the radical movements of the world were trying to get the US to help fight fascism, you know, to help get rid of Hitler. And it was decided that there would be, and there was a worldwide united front against fascism that took on different forms in different places, depending on what was happening. And the United Front Against Fascism in the US took the form of saying, hey, if the US sends its military over to Europe to help get rid of Hitler, revolutionaries in the US won't use that weakness to overthrow them during that time. And as a matter of fact, the organizing took on a different tenor. And so that was when, and for other reasons as well, but mainly for that, that was when the Communist Party USA, the biggest radical organization in the United States at the time, went underground, right? And meaning that people didn't literally disappear. They just started working, and all of a sudden they're not radical, they're not revolutionary, they're not communist, they're progressive, right? They're, you know, working in different milieus and not putting out the radical vision that they had, that it gained them so much trust of the community. And that was part of the United Front Against Fascism. Now, in order to, and so that set it up. So by the time the early 50s came and the House Un-American Activities Committee was able to go around and saying, you know, that person's been lying to you. You know, they're saying they're progressive, they're a communist, you know, and in some cases it was true. They were lying to them. They had hidden their politic. Whereas had that happened 15 years before, people would be like, yeah, I know they're a communist. They told me that as they were helping me move my furniture in from being evicted, right? So it held weight because communists had gone underground, right? And so at the same time, it also made them vulnerable to the right-wing movements that were happening inside of the union movements, which were kicking out all the radicals. Now, interestingly enough, one of the few unions that openly refused to kick out the communists and refused to kick out the radicals were the longshoremen. And the longshoremen, because of that, to this day, are the most militant and radical union that's out there. Like, they'll shut shit down for a struggle happening in South Africa. They shut down the ports for that. They shut down the ports for Black Lives Matter. How, you know, that's somewhat symbolic, but you know, it's still happening. I mean, it still happened. So, but due to that, the going underground and the House Un-American Activities Committee happening, and a split around what was announced about Stalin and the things that happened there, and the CPUSA's response or non-response to it, or critique of it, there became that biggest revolutionary radical group split up into all these little groups that then a few years later were known as the New Left. We think of them as the New Left of the 1960s. And now the New Left, they took on a different tenor than what had happened in the 15 years before, because they said, they came out openly and said, fuck you, I'm a communist. As a matter of fact, that is how House Un-American Activity Committees stopped being able to operate is that when they came to San Francisco, the radicals went into the meetings and said, "Fuck you, I'm a communist." And they got scared. The government got scared that these would be rallying points to make communism popular again, right? So they stopped doing that stuff, right? So anyway, but one of the things that the New Left did was also move away from those places that had, in the 20, 25 years before, been the milieus for radical organizing, which was on the job, which was geographically in the states that used to be red and now are red for different reasons. Places like Montana, Utah, Oklahoma, Colorado, Alabama, right? They moved away from those places. They moved people, concentrated them in cities and in universities, right? So, and again, I'm essentializing this is not the total history of the left. I don't claim it to be, but these are important moves that happen, right? Because obviously part of the New Left, I'm sure you have all talked about it, was Detroit Revolutionary Union movement. And they took a concerted effort to say, we are going to organize in radical ways, in the auto industry and with radical vision. But those things were definitely different than the rest of the New Left. But so what happens when you focus your organizing on students, right? Well, obviously you can't strike in the same way. You don't handle what is the crux of capitalism. The main operating point, the leverage point of capitalism, the main motor of capitalism is the exploitation of labor, right? So I'm just saying this to get to another point, because I'm sure many of you know that is the actual value that's put in there by the worker and the profit that's taken away, right? And so that is where our power is in the ability to shut down industry. Now, and I know that's been separated as this one thing, and then there's these other movements that are happening, and that's something else, but it's really all the same thing. And as a matter of fact, organizing in the Bay Area since the 80s, there was always a thing that would happen where we try to get somebody to come to things where, like, hey, come on Saturday to this rally, come after work to this rally. And people be like, I'm fucking trying to hustle. I don't know what, this and that. And a lot of people not realizing that when people are talking and complaining about racist oppression and complaining about the lack of ability to just live their lives, they're complaining about a question of power and resources and material things, right? These are material things, like and we have to handle those as material things. People are spending their lives in a struggle, and usually that's at work, and they're struggling individually, and it's our job to collectivize that struggle, but not just to change something a little bit, but to take that fight and make it the big change, to change the whole system. Now, in the 60s, since things started getting focused on students, you started hearing radicals saying in the United States at least, saying things like, the students are the revolution. It was something that was historically inaccurate and didn't have any relationship to any real revolutionary movement other than what was happening at the same time in China with the Cultural Revolution, which were students that were saying to the revolutionaries, the generation older, saying, you said you were building a revolution, let's do it for real, right? And so, but other than that, the students are part of a revolution, but they aren't the revolution, right? And so, but once you have moved and changed, move that focus, then instead of, then demonstrations don't just become demonstrations, they're the be all end all. Whereas in the 20s and 30s, when they had all those things going on, they would have marches with 50,000 people, with 30,000 people. And those marches were demonstrations, but they were demonstrations in the real sense that they demonstrated a power, because those were 30,000 people that could shut down this industry or that industry. It was demonstrating power, right? But we changed that to be about just demonstrating that we're upset about something. And you know, and it was a slow change. It's not that everybody already believed that. In the 60s, we see that even the civil rights movement, we hear about the March on Washington, and it was really the March on Washington for jobs and justice, right? But that's been separated from us. So, you know, getting back to being an artist, often I'll say this. So I'm a product of that new left. I joined an organization called Progressive Labor Party in the 80s, which was the group that were helping to do those farm workers movements, and they were of the new left and who had broken off from the Communist Party. And so I'm definitely, I come from that, and some of what happened with the whole left because of that, if everyone's focused on you know, demonstrations and just making a statement on spectacle, and subtract it from how change comes through power relationship and where our power is, and the fact that our power in changing any of this comes from our power to withhold our labor, then if that's subtracted from things, then folks that know better start writing books about everything else. It stops being about, like, how do we organize in a way that exercises the power that we have in this economic system, and they start focusing on all sorts of things, that from language to and obviously I'm an artist. I'm concerned with language. I'm concerned with image. I'm concerned with all of these things. But I know that what motivates culture is actual material ability, the material power that we have or don't have, and how we exercise that power, and who we are functionally in this system. I know that is what determines culture. So one of the worst compliments that I've ever gotten, and I've gotten a few times, was, you know, in the 90s, a few times people came to me and said, look, I really love your music, but you know, I'm out here struggling, and I got to listen to that real shit. You know, and right now people know the term real shit is supposedly gangster shit or this or that, whatever, real shit. But what are they saying really when they say that? What they're saying is that, and unfortunately, I think our music might be different, but gets lumped in with what the music that was calling itself conscious. A lot of that music was saying, you got to get your shit together, and you know, like, you're not wearing the right clothes, you're doing the wrong things to your fellow person, and all that kind of stuff, right? And it was talking about a thing that wasn't there. Like, we were wearing the African medallions that Public Enemy inspired us to wear, but you go home and there's no food on the table. You still are struggling to pay the rent. However, a song that talks about selling dope will say you can go sell a rock for $10, and you really can go sell a rock for $10. It's connected to a material movement that's happening that has some effect on material lives. And so the movement that if the movement that artists are connecting to is not something that has a chance of changing things materially, then that art is going to not connect in the same way with the people that it's aimed at, right? That art has to be connected not just to social movements, it has to be connected to that, but it has to be engaged with social movements that have the ability to shut down industry, with social movements that have the vision to not only shut down industry to get immediate reform, but to build those campaigns of immediate reform into a larger revolutionary framework that aims to build something where we can shut the whole thing down and build our own system, an economic system in which the people democratically control the wealth that we create with our labor. And I think that having that radical vision is the way that we get people to get involved in movements on the job and in struggles, because if it becomes very technical and it's time to go on strike, they don't necessarily always know if you're going to have their back. But if what you have is a passion that says we're taking this further, this is being part of something larger, then people are going to join you. And I think I see some messages, so I think I don't know. I have no idea how long I've been going. I can keep going, or we can. Somebody want to tell me?
I think this is the perfect opportunity to enter the Q&A portion of it.
All right.
And I can kick it off. We have a couple questions that folks have been submitting. The first of which is, sorry to bother you, was shocking, surreal. Is this a method of bypassing cultural biases around race and organizing? That is, the rationalized arguments we all have absorbed justifying oppression.
Could you say it one more time?
Sure, I can say it again. Sorry to bother you was shocking and surreal. Is this a method of bypassing cultural biases around race and organizing? That is, the rationalized arguments we all have absorbed justifying oppression.
So, well, the shocking and surreal part is one. I could try to be objective about it. Part of it is I like that kind of art. That is, and why do I like that kind of art? Because it makes me engage with it, right? It makes me think about, it makes me actually think about the contours of the material world around me and think about the differences between that. The shock, that's the surreal aspect of it. And the shocking part, it does a similar thing. It keeps you on your toes. But objectively, what I can say about it is that, a lot of times when we're talking about ideas, when we're talking about analysis, we're talking about juxtaposing one idea with the other so we can show that contradiction, right? And doing that in certain, showing the contradiction, heightening the contradiction so that you can see it, is often in art thought of as is an absurd act, right? Like there are certain things that right now we don't, we're used to seeing, for instance, in film, like if this was a film and I was to get up and walk over there, walk out a frame, and then all of a sudden it pops a frame and I'm at a cafe or something. Like early on, that'd be like, what the hell are they saying? How, he didn't go out the door, he didn't get in the car, blah, 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 but that's showing I wanted to go someplace and I'm there, and it shows the contrast between the two spaces. That's an absurd thing that we're used to, right? We're used to that idea. And I think some of the things that I'm doing in here seem absurd because they're ideas that often aren't talked about in film, right? And so And also because there are ideas that aren't all often talked about in films, I didn't want to just talk about it. I didn't want to have the characters having a discussion about it. I wanted to show how those ideas felt. And so yeah, that, you know, it's all a tool. It's all tools for that. And yeah, the more you can engage people and have them think about what's around them and what's, you know, to a certain extent, what's different about what they're watching than what they would normally be watching, and why that's different. You know, it's a little dance, because you also don't, you know, you don't necessarily want people to be thinking about how they hold the camera or anything like that. But it's part of what we all do to a certain extent. That the, you know, heightening contradiction, and it's just that these ideas are ones that aren't normally there. So they made me heighten different contradictions and made me build absurdity around different things that normally would be there.
Yeah, I think that's really special because you're kind of speaking about storytelling and all the work that you're doing, which is really cool to hear about, because I feel like there are probably a lot of people in the audience that are also learning about that and trying to be on that storytelling journey. So that's really cool to hear. We have another question. How does building working class solidarity work in the age of gigification and contract work?
I think it's so I think there's always a new phenomenon that we got to deal with, right? And that we have to figure out. But as I was saying with the longshore thing, that was the big argument against organizing longshore workers, was that they're all at these different piers, you know, and the ships come in at different places, and everybody, back then, people were getting fired every day and rehired and stuff like that. So it usually means doing things that are more militant, right? So in Paris, for instance, the taxi drivers didn't want Uber to be there. And there's a famous tweet by Courtney Love, because she was in Paris, and the cab drivers had just the day before said, nobody better be driving Uber tomorrow. And, you know, because they said, look, you know, Uber needs to pay the same things that we're paying. And, you know, it's a lot of North African immigrants that are driving the cabs there, and other parts of Africa as well. And so there's a famous tweet by Courtney Love in Paris where she's afraid because she was in an Uber and the cab stopped in front of it and reached in and grabbed the driver's keys and threw them out, and said, and this was on the freeway, and she had to walk off the freeway. And the reason why is because that's what the cab drivers were doing. They said, look, if we see any cars where there's an adult driving and an adult sitting in the back and nobody sitting in the passenger seat, we're stopping them. And they did. And I think they won whatever that was. Some sort of compromise was made. But the point is that they had to come up with a new way of stopping production. And so we'll come up with those new ways. I don't know what they are. I think they're, you know, it's different for the folks that are working at home. That's a hard thing. How do you strike when you're doing that? You know, but there are other gig jobs that do have a physical place to be, there are ways to organize around that. It takes a lot more. It takes a lot more ingenuity, it takes a lot more people. It also maybe takes help from folks, you know, like if there was you know, for instance, if there was and it also takes getting things to a higher level of organizing, you know. So if we were at a different period of time, and let's say everybody at the gas stations was also organized, and there was a strike with Uber, they could be like, look, Uber's on strike, so anybody trying to fill up their Uber right now, you know, they're a scab, we're not letting you fill up, right? There could be all sorts of things like that. That's where more solidarity comes in, and actual, things to do. I brought up before we went on, there's this documentary called Rocking the Foundations that was made in the 80s about the Building Labour Federation in Australia. And they were actually in Sydney, and they had gone from, like kind of a non-worker corrupt, excuse me, working with where the leaders were working with the bosses, to radicals taking them over, and becoming a very militant union where they would go in and they would go to scabs' houses and beat up scabs, and they were able to win strikes that way, right? But then they were like, well, we want to be militant and we want to show radical working class solidarity. And in that, they saw that there was a group of Maori and of Aboriginal and white folks that were organizing against gentrification in a certain neighborhood in Melbourne, and they were in Sydney. And they found out that the people that were trying to gentrify it was this one developer, and they were working on buildings that were owned by that developer, and they shut down all the construction sites in Sydney that were owned by that developer to get them to stop doing that. So those are acts of radical solidarity. I would say even at this time, we're at a different place than we have been before. And so these acts of radical solidarity in organizing are way more possible. We just had, and I stopped checking, but there's a thing called paydayreport.com. And as of January, between January and January of this year and March of last year, there had been 1,300 strikes, most of them wildcats, right? And a lot of that you could say is militant, not necessarily radical, but a few of them were radical, right? One of them you heard about, where the folks that were working on jet engines shut down the factory and said, we're not going to make jet engines. We want to make respirators. That's when folks thought that respirators were needed. That was radical solidarity happening there. And 1,300 strikes, that's the most strike wave that we had since the 40s, right? We haven't had that. We're not talking about those things. I'm sure since this is the School of Labor Relations that they're probably talking about that here. But most people don't know about that, because it would increase our sense about what we should be doing, right? And what we are capable of doing, right? A lot of what we call for is based on what we think people will be okay with, right? And based on where we think people are at. We're at a place where 43, it's been said over and over for the last, 8-9 years, 43% of millennials believe there should be that we should have a socialist society. I'm sorry, 51% of millennials believe that we should have a socialist society. 43% of all ages believe that we should have a socialist society, right? We're in a time of opportunity to move things forward in ways, and of course we're going to have setbacks. We're going to have problems. We're not going to win every union vote that there is, but we're going to come back and people are going to be more willing, and we're going to keep fighting, and people are going to see that some of these struggles actually work, right? The thing that the longshoremen did, which was a symbolic act, but we can see how afraid folks were. But the longshoremen during last year in June, they shut down the whole West Coast from Vancouver to San Diego for a day, as out in solidarity with the George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter movement. And they put a call out for other people to join them. I think there's somebody else that joined them that I'm forgetting, but one of the folks that joined them were the Tesla workers. Tesla workers in California walked out. As soon as they walked out, Elon Musk got scared and said, "Hey, you got the day off," and so that it wouldn't seem like a strike, right? Because that's how scared folks are of this kind of thing. Not just being about just what we think of as trade union issues, but being shown that we can use the withholding of labor as power to stop all these things, that are going on. I mean, I always say, what would have happened if radicals had been organizing in St. Louis for 10 years before Mike Jones got killed? And said when he got killed, did even a general strike that just shut down a couple industries in St. Louis, right? Immediately, that cop would have gotten an indictment, right? Because why? Because that's where power is in this system. That's where power is. And I might be preaching to the choir, but I think the connection here is that we can make these connections of where we're organizing for power, and make them with larger movements, so that folks see where other people see where power is, and get inspired to have their movements connect to something real like that.
Definitely, like the challenges you mentioned about not having like a natural workplace environment for folks who are in the gig economy. It's important to talk about having radical action, definitely. We have our next question. How do you effectively create revolutionary forms of art that doesn't get commodified or spectacularized by the same systems that your art is critiquing?
It's gonna get commodified. I mean, everything we are doing here, I could buy an outfit at Walmart that looks like a Black Bloc outfit, right? And it's not really. I don't think our goal should be to try to create some alternate economy that operates inside of capitalism, because you can't. Like, we've seen that happen. So there are people that are our great grandparents' age that were doing collectives and communes inside of the United States and throughout Europe and that sort of thing. And with the idea that this is some prefigurative thing that will show how things are. So my goal is to get people to become part of a mass, militant, radical labor movement that can shut down industry and create space for a revolutionary movement, right? And so how do I do that? I have to get to them. It's not real, and believe me, I'm in those milieus where folks are creating their alternative thing. Like, oh, we figured out an alternative way to distribute our record. And, it's, we've seen all sorts of things like that. Or we have an alternative venue. We play those venues. We do that. We also, played the House of Blues and, whatever arena has the latest software company, his name on it, those sorts of things, because the point is to get to people. And my message is not to get people to try to opt out of capitalism, because you can't. And I think when you do that, you give them a false idea of how power works under capitalism. How power works under capitalism is they exploit workers. They exploit people at the job, and that's how power comes to be under capitalism. Obviously, there are ways that works. How do they exploit people? Now, racist oppression is a big part of how they're able to do that. And patriarchy is a big part of how they're able to do that. But their point is to get to the place where they can exploit, have economic exploitation and build wealth and power, because the wealth brings the power. Now, if I were to say to people like, hey, stop buying the stuff from, the evil corporations and only buy them from the good indie corporations, I'm giving the wrong message. I'm telling them that there's a such thing as safe indie capitalism. And that's a non-threatening message at all, to anyone, because you're still part of the market in the first place. You're still making that happen. And let's say, someone spends their life trying to figure out distribution systems where no money is exchanged. And so, well, first of all, you've spent your life doing that instead of organizing the working class for something that could actually take power. And the other thing is that you're still not handling the main contradiction under capitalism, which is the exploitation of labor. And so a lot of these other things, boycotts became popular in the stead of strikes. So I mean, I think about one very popularized boycott, and this is, and I don't know if it was the first one, but it was very popularized in the 60s and 70s. And, my learning about this came from the farm workers who I helped organize in the 80s. The United Farm Workers Union kind of was part of popularizing this idea of boycott grapes, and you boycott to help this struggle. But the reason they were doing that was because they couldn't strike, because the United Farm Workers refused to organize undocumented workers. They were against undocumented workers. They called them all sorts of names, and they actually helped immigration officers to deport people, right? So if you're gonna do that, and that's who's working in the fields, you're not organizing a strike. So you're gonna ask for a boycott. And boycotts became really popular because they make us all feel like we're doing something, and we're not doing anything with them. Like, I think sometimes they can be good to, okay, I'm being hyperbolic. We're doing something with them, but we are, they're helpful maybe in terms of popularizing the fact that if somebody's on strike somewhere or whatever. But Manning Marable, no, it was, I think Earl Fari Hutcherson had a book, The Myth of Black Capitalism. I forget which one it is, but and in it they had a study of there had been this boycott that was done by Jesse Jackson on behalf of the Black liquor store owners throughout the South, and it was a boycott of Coca-Cola, where they were like, none of these stores, and it was hundreds of stores, are going to sell Coca-Cola, and Black people are going to stop buying Coca-Cola until you give a better deal to the Black liquor store owners, and maybe make some Black hires. They did this whole boycott for a year or whatever, and at the end, Coca-Cola did the thing that they were doing. And this book, The Myth of Black Capitalism, they study that, and they count the amount of money that Coca-Cola lost. I think it went on for a couple of years or something like that. That amount of money was equal to the miscellaneous traveling costs of their executives for less than a year. Meaning, that wasn't forcing them to do anything, right? That wasn't a thing that forced their hand in any kind of way, right? If anything, it was something where they planned it to show like, hey, we're cool and we understand, you asked and we delivered, that sort of a thing, right? It was a promo bit for them. It wasn't something that boycotting doesn't do enough economic damage to actually change the situation. Striking does. And it's easier to promote boycotts because obviously, I'm sure as you're learning here, organizing on the job is hard. It's like you got to talk to people that don't agree with you. You got to get them on your side. You're not just finding the people who, agree with everything. You're talking to people that you may not even aesthetically align with in various ways. And you're uniting with folks that you otherwise wouldn't maybe unite with. So it's a hard thing. It's much easier to be like, everybody who agrees with me, come meet with me Saturday at 2. It's a lot easier. And so we lean towards those sorts of things, and then we take them on as, because that's all we have, we take them on as a, belief system that, a strong belief system. But so my art is going to be commodified. The question is my art going to inspire people to join those kinds of movements that actually can change the way things are? And so that's a question that I'm hoping I can answer, but I don't know. I know I don't know. It all really is a trial and error sort of thing.
Okay. So we do have one more question. We're going to actually extend to 8:10, if that's okay, just because we lost the 10 minutes at the front.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll try to squeeze in as many as we can, but we think possibly this one might be the last one. So the question is, what is it, do you think, about music that it has such a significant role in labor struggles and class struggles? And how do those struggles intersect with musical influence? They say that they're thinking, for instance, of the roots reggae movement and its influencing of the late 70s, early 80s punk movement in the UK, leading up to something like the Brixton riots, culminating in something like a song, The Specials' Ghost Town.
Well, that question is making, like always, to back it up really far. I have this book somewhere, I can't remember what it is, but it's about songs and radical movements starting in the early 1900s in the United States. And what I found was interesting is there were radicals in the 19 teens and 20s who were really inspired by the revolutions that were happening around the world. And some of those revolutions had gained power and had their own anthems, right? That were kind of classically inspired, and you needed like a lot of people to do them. And so there were a bunch of radicals in New York in the 1920s who were like, they weren't down with folk music because they thought folk music was backwards. They thought folk music was purposely apolitical. And I don't know which songs they're talking about, but this is what they put forward, and that they needed to make these grand songs that had a lot of people involved in them, and had all these movements and suites in them, and kind of sounded like maybe some of the singing might have sounded like the Internationale or something like that. But and Pete Seeger's father, Charles Seeger, was the person that was saying that it was one of the main people at first saying like fuck folk music, right? But people, organizers, were like, what the fuck are you talking about? We can't sing that shit on a strike line, right? And obviously there was other folks like Joe Hill who were interpolating other melodies and putting radical lyrics on songs. I'm sorry, can you, 1 second, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. So yeah, they, you know, and there have been folks like Joe Hill and stuff like that. And obviously Woody Guthrie was disagreeing with that. And that was a battle that luckily the folk singers won at the time. And our idea of what, but there was that group of musicians that thought that, you know, that had strong arguments that this certain kind of music was the thing that was aesthetically more radical and going to influence people more. So what we do know is that, you know, sometimes our ideas of, you know, what's more radical, you know, as far as music, is something you can't, you know, or what's more effective, something you can't know necessarily beforehand. It's something that, you know, is gained through trial and error and working with folks and observing what's out there and what happens. And, you know, and I could get into the weeds on like rap styles and things like that, that like maybe like radicals get like excited by this one person and then they start doing that same style, but maybe for the people they're organizing, that means a whole different thing to them, right? But we're attached to that style because that's the person that inspired us. And it's not necessarily helping us do the thing we want to do. But I think, so that's only kind of what part of what the person was asking. But I think, you know, it's hard to often, you know, music historians will go back and say that this music made this thing happen in real life. And, you know, it's always, you know, one of those sort of Rashomon sort of things where, you know, you can tell that story in different ways. And, you know, I think that dance hall had an effect, and music from Jamaica had an effect, not because of the music, but because of the people, right, that were there, that were in Britain, that were affecting the questions of what the working class was at the time, right? There's a, you know, KRS-One had this album called The Blueprint of Hip Hop, and what he was saying was like, you know, the popular music of the time is always of the most oppressed people that are making music. Why? Maybe because of the passion, maybe because of because the struggles that the most oppressed people are in are ones that connect with, that are part of our humanity, part of us thinking about our existence and how we and how we want to be in the world, right? So I mean, this would, you know, that's a longer thing. So that's kind of why, you know, some of the discussions of what's cultural appropriation and what's not, I don't think, I think miss the point sometimes, is that, you know, in the sense that this is what music is supposed to do. A lot of the music that we think of as even white working class music is music that came from, you know, people of color, Black folks and other folks. And that connection isn't always, you know, one of malice. It's one of wanting to be part of struggling against, you know, the ruling class, and looking for music that is, that speaks to that. Steve Earle, the country singer, had a song called The Ballad of Johnny Walker Lind. And in it, so Johnny Walker Lind was this white kid from Marin who joined the Taliban in the 90s and went over there and, you know, and was hardcore. And when the US invaded, he fought the US, right? And he got arrested and brought to the US, and I don't know, anyway, but so Steve Earle, who was this platinum selling country artist, made a song from Johnny Walker Lynd's perspective called The Ballad of Johnny Walker Lynd, which got Steve banned from country radio. But in it, he says, you know, he's saying, look, I was looking all over MTV, you know, and, you know, I didn't see anything that felt like me. And then, you know, he was searching and looking for something that felt real and felt honest, and wanted to be part of that. And so I think that some of that is, you know, what goes on with some of those some of those some of those music trends are about people trying to connect with struggle and people wanting to be part of a struggle. And often, just like many of us, our first step is, what are we listening to? What are we reading? What are, you know, and we're wanting to connect with that. And so, yeah, I think that that to reduce it to music sometimes is also not seeing that music was popular in Britain because there were struggles happening. There were fascists, and there was an anti-fascist movement, and there was a lot of militant things going on, like the miners' strike and things like that. So I'm sure I'm hitting a little bit of the point, but maybe missing most of it. But so.
No, that was great. I think we have time for one more question since we have 10 minutes left. This question says, this event is co-hosted by the Park Center for Independent Media, Ithaca College. Can you talk about the importance of indie media and talk about how you dealt with the distribution of Sorry to Bother You?
Yeah, I think, you know, definitely for me, I can first speak personally. For me, a lot of things that I found out, I got led to by independent media. Democracy Now! There was a thing called the Z Mag still exists. You know, it was online, or Z Online. A lot of things that you know led me to other things. So independent media is very important, and especially you know, the books exist, and you know, especially when we're talking about certain ideas, books exist and all of that. But the truth is, you only have so many hours in your life, and you need guidance from folks. Like, here's something you should read. Here's something you should know about, right? And so if, you know, with mainstream media, they're often leading the conversation, even to the extent that we feel like, oh, well, now we have Twitter and Instagram. But even when it's trying to be something else, it's a reflection of what they've gotten us talking about, right? And then us like delving off from there. And it, you know, and so independent media is going to become even more and more important, and folks putting those links out there to independent media, because you know it's a lot easier to get lied to these days. I think it's always been easy to get lied to, but now we have this assumption that the information we're seeing on social media is somehow democratized. It's somehow just whatever everybody's talking about, that's what is there. Like, so many times I've heard they've been saying, they're saying, or this and that. And with this idea that if enough people are saying it, it must be true, right? But the real thing is that enough people are saying it because other people are saying it, right? And so, you know, I know when it's gotten to the point where you say algorithms and you seem like a conspiracy nut, but the point is that we don't, that right now, we're not in control over what we see, you know, coming down our timelines. And when it was network TV, when everybody was watching that, we had this idea that somebody's doing this, somebody's putting that out. Now we have this idea that everything I'm seeing is generated by a bunch of humans and it's just whatever they want to talk about. And so we believe so much more bullshit than we would otherwise believe, right? And they can make us think everybody thinks a certain thing, right? So case in point, since we know documentedly in the last year, there's been 1,300 strikes, and many of them wildcat, including like on the East Coast, 13,000 carpenters and, you know, all sorts of things like that. Seems like everybody should know about that. If it's just like people talk, you know, hey, I was on strike today, that sort of thing, like it would get to you. But it doesn't. It does. Most people don't know about it. It doesn't get to them. And maybe some of the folks watching here, it might get to you a little bit more because, you know, you're part of that little, you know, enclave that they've made on social media, that so you can all talk to each other. But so independent media becomes really important, a really important way to document and promote what's happening with radical movements. So, and as far as sorry to bother you, how I got that made, it took 7 years, and it's like stone soup, and I think it's like how everything works is like, you know, there's an idea, and then you like say to somebody, here's this idea, you put yours in, let's do it. Then you're like saying to somebody else, this person's down, come on, put this idea in, put that idea in, and all of a sudden it's a thing. And well, not all of a sudden, like I said, it took 7 years, right? But you know, it becomes a thing that you got a train that's gonna happen. This thing is gonna happen whether you get on it or not. So are you gonna get on it? So for me, it was a lot of little by little making it seem legitimate. So McSweeney's putting it out in 2014 as its own paperback book. That said, oh, this is probably good writing, because before that, it was hard to get people to even read it. Like your friends, they're like, God damn, how many pages is it? You know, like, or just somebody you're sending it on to an email and like, yeah, I'm gonna get around to that in a couple weeks or blah, blah, blah. Because you don't expect that shit to be good, right? Like, so Dave Eggers at McSweeney's putting it out as its own paperback book was a seal that said, okay, this is good writing. So then people started reading the PDF that I had been sending. Then I was able to get SF Film to make me a filmmaker in resident, which was a thing they do for like 10 filmmakers, and you get office space. So then that made it seem like, oh, there's filmmaker next to my name. All of a sudden, oh, he's a filmmaker, you know, and then that then was able to get a couple indie producers on, and it looked like they'd gotten small films made. So maybe this is a movie that can actually get made. Then Sundance took it on, and all of that is all connected. So Sundance took it on as I got in the labs. Then with that, a lot of financiers think that if you get into the Sundance labs, you're definitely getting into the festival. And while it's not true, I let people keep believing that, you know. And so all of those, you know, just in a nutshell, all these little steps along the way. And a lot of people ask about the politics of it. Was it hard in regards to the politics? The truth is that everybody thinks that they are against the system. Everybody thinks they are against the system. And to some extent, everybody is, you know, philosophically, most people are philosophically against the system, right? They feel like they're the exception, right? So a story that I tell a lot that's not my story to tell, but I tell it anyway. It's Tom Morello's story, is when Rage Against the Machine was shooting I think it's Sleep Now in the Fire on Wall Street in New York. They had, Michael Moore was directing the video, and their whole plan was to go there and play the song over and over and just film that, and that the police would come take them away, and that would be the video. And so when they got there, they played the song loud. People were looking around like, what's going on? Played it again. Police start radioing, security gates go down. They play it a third time, and then they start hearing this thing from down the street. It's going, rah, 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 rah. So they don't know what it is. They play again, and it's still getting louder. The chant is getting louder. Rah, rah, rah. Well, a couple more times, and they see, from a couple blocks down, what it is. There's a big crowd like coming around the corner, and they're all, rah, rah, rah. And it's clearly people that work on Wall Street from the way they're dressed. They're dressed in business attire, and it's just rah, rah, rah. And as it gets closer, they hear what they're saying. They're saying, suits for rage, suits for rage. And what it is that they were all Rage Against the Machines fans. They said suits for rage because they knew the contradiction, that they're working on Wall Street, and that these were the politics of Rage Against the Machine were talking about, a revolutionary thing. So they knew the contradiction. And so what it is that people do what they do based on what they think can happen in the world. People, if they don't think a giant radical change can happen, or that whatever they're doing is not going to matter in it, then people just accept how it is, and they get whatever, they get in where they fit in. And the whole world is made up of that. I'm talking about from people working at fast food to people working at talent agencies, to people that are executives at record labels and at movie studios. Everybody's like, I wish there was a different world. I'm not down with the way this is. I'm just doing what I'm doing because there's no other way to do anything, right? So on the one hand, sorry to bother you, part of it was that everybody was focused on the naked horses, and they didn't even think about everything else when they're talking. That was the main controversy, right? I'm not that they didn't think about it, but that was the main controversy, is should you have a movie like that? But on the other hand, you'd hear so many people being like, man, I spent my whole life working with all this stuff that's bullshit, and I'm so happy to be able to, finally do something that is something I agree with, right? So, and because, often with art that has radical politic, all it takes is somebody to whisper like, well, the politics of that's not going to sell. That's going to be, and so it ends up being supposedly not a political decision. It just is somebody, whispering it away. So yeah, we were able to, all the timing and those little things led up to that being able to happen. And right now is the time that radical art can get made. I think it's important for radical artists to be connected to movements that are actually involved in winnable material campaigns. And the reason why, and by connected to, I mean involved in trying to get people into that. And I don't mean just by saying it on Twitter. I know now is a different time right now because of COVID, but it's about to be over, or at least things are about to change. But a part of making your art is understanding where people are at. And I don't think we get a good idea of that from social media. Understanding what it is that's when you're trying to get somebody involved in a on-the-job action, what it is that's making them not want to be involved, what they're scared of, what they might possibly be motivated by. Knowing that because you're actually trying to get people involved and you can only know that if you're involved in things that are winnable. Like if it's like, you know, I don't know, like there's some campaigns that I think are more like just philosophical, like, you know, I don't know, you know, that are like, oh, just revolution. We want revolution. Like a lot of people, I want revolution, but I know that saying that just, you're not giving anybody anything to grab onto. And they're like, okay. And so you don't even get to see what people's problems with getting involved with something are. But if you have something where somebody could win or they could lose and they're taking a risk, then you get to see what the contradictions are. And then your art takes on a different tenor. It's not just these theoretical ideas. It's based on people's, you know, what it takes to move people. So.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this was so insightful, and I feel like I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that I feel like I learned a lot from you tonight. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And I want to add one more thing as far as art and organizing. So many people have the ability to make art. And so many of you who might be out there not thinking of themselves as an artist, just thinking of yourself as someone who wants to get involved in organizing or things like that. But you're the people we need in art. We don't need you out to not be organizing, but we need you to be making things that can communicate to many people. And, you know, in that same way that indie media is important, that art being made by people who have a passion for changing the world is really important right now. So.
Those are great words to end off our event. Thank you all for coming out. And hopefully we'll see you for future Union Days events. You all have a good night.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Virtual applause.